economist. He says, empire is irrational because it costs more than what we get out of it. The British, it cost them more in India than what they got out of it. The American investment in the Philippines is only about $3.5 billion, but we had to give them about $6 billion in aid. It costs us more than what we get out of it. And that's when you think without a class analysis, because as we know, as you're going to know before the evening's over, that it's very profitable. Because the people who have the $3 billion investment aren't the same ones as the people who pay the $6 billion. As Thorsten Veblen said back in 1909, and Boulding should have read him even if he is a Marxist, as Veblen said, the wealth that's extracted from imperialism goes into the coffers of the select few, whereas the costs of empire are paid out of the common treasure of the people. And so it was with the British Empire in India. It was the Brits, the ordinary working people, who paid for the cost of empire. It was the Bank of England and the East India Trading Company that got the cream. And so with the Philippines, right, of course with a good skim to your collaborator, your comprador there, what he got just in shoes for his wife. God knows his shoes for his girlfriends. Okay. Another resource in the third world that attracts capital investment. And you say to yourself, what is that mysterious resource? I'm looking at El Salvador, right? And I'm looking at the companies that are in El Salvador. And I look and I see Pillsbury, Procter & Gamble, U.S. Steel, Continental, ITT, Firestone, Ford. And I'm saying to myself, wait a minute, what the hell's in El Salvador? A little sugar, bananas. What are all these companies doing there? What they're doing is they're manufacturing everything from energy rods to baking powder, from auto tires to computers. They're in El Salvador because of a very precious resource in El Salvador, which is the cheap labor, which is paying people 50 cents an hour. Instead of having to pay auto workers $15 an hour up here. You go down there and you pay them 15 cents or 50 cents an hour. That becomes a very attractive thing. And you go to South Korea. New York Times had a story about the South Korean farm girls who work in the textile companies that used to be in New England until they moved south. And then when the Southern workers unionized, they moved to South Korea, where there's a nice fascist little country where if the workers try to unionize, they get beaten up and thrown in jail or they get shot dead. And the Korean farm girls in those textile compounds are working for 18 cents an hour. 18 cents an hour for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. No time off. And if you want a day off, you work a double shift if you want to go see your family again on the farm. And they live in compounds. That's the Industrial Revolution. That's 1870s. But that's big profit. And that's what they call capital investment, development, friendly nation, staunch ally, good relations, stabilization, stability. And General Motors, when they tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that they've got to pave over Detroit and they've got to close down factories because the cars aren't selling as well as they should, what they don't tell you is that in the last 10 years, General Motors has opened up a dozen new factories in other countries for the reasons I've just talked about. So here's another resource. This, in fact, is the key resource, the resource which is the source of wealth, along with natural resources, which is labor. Because one thing about labor, it's one of the commodities of production. It's the one commodity that does not use up its own value entirely in that process of production. It creates wealth. Now there's another development, though, that's come with all of this. And that other development is that revolutionary movements have been emerging all around the world, these competing social orders. And so they must be targeted. Now, the United States has given a number of reasons for why, Ronald Reagan has most vividly recently, for why we must go on with our military buildup and our intervention in third worlds, why we must attack countries like Nicaragua, why we must oppose guerrilla movements in El Salvador, why we must try to overthrow Afghanistan, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and various other countries where the forces of social change are taking place. And the reason they give is the freedom of the people there for democracy. We are in Central America to defend democracy. Well, a moment's reflection would raise some serious questions about that hypothesis, because it becomes clear that in fact the U.S. government has a record in recent years of overthrowing democracies. In Chile, Salvador Allende, elected in a free and open election, was overthrown. 10,000 people were executed. Tens of thousands of others were driven into exile. Others have been put in prison. And you have one of the worst fascist dictatorships, all with the support of the United States, which after Allende's election cut off all aid except to the Chilean military. In Guatemala in 1954, the Arbenz government was instituted, and Arbenz legalized all student organizations. Students were very powerful. The first democratically elected president of Guatemala. Arbenz legalized trade unions, opposition newspapers, and then he started doing some very dangerous things. He began to nationalize the unused land of United Fruit Company. And that's when U.S. corporations and the CIA went in and overthrew Arbenz. And that's a matter of public record, by the way. The CIA, the Eisenhower administration, admits that. Eisenhower proudly boasted of how the CIA overthrew Arbenz, because he was a serious leftist influence. And so with Mossadegh in Iran, so with Gulad in Brazil, so with Bosch in the Dominican Republic, so with a variety of other democratic leaders, at least 6 or 7 in Latin America, who were overthrown and generals brought in with the aid and assistance of the U.S. government. So it can't be that we're there to foster democracy. We seem to also make war against democracies. And in addition, we support some of the worst dictators. If Reagan is really against tyranny, if he really hates tyranny, why doesn't he send freedom fighters into Paraguay or Chile or South Africa? Why doesn't he start sabotaging there, putting a squeeze on them? In fact, the whole fight with Libya might be less of a mystery if you understand that really the worst thing about Colonel Gaddafi, who is a kind of a strange guy in some ways, but not as strange as the media has made him out. He has called, and you don't know this, most of you who laugh, he has called repeatedly for negotiations between him and Reagan, for peaceful negotiations, for peaceful settlement of all disputes, and the Reagan administration has repeatedly rebuffed those overtures. That isn't put in the press. I'm not blaming you for not knowing it. You're not going to read it in that rag that I saw out there, that Colorado thing that said, terrorist targets hit in Libya. He has done that, and he's done some other things which make him really dangerous. It's not the terrorism. It's not the attack on the Vienna and Berlin airports, for which they have no proof that Libya was involved, and which they have proof that the terrorists came out of Syria. The troublesome thing about Gaddafi is that when he took over in 1969, he took over a country that was like Saudi Arabia, a country of mass misery, a lot of rich oil that went into the pockets of a few rich. And when his colonel's revolution took over, they got rid of the rich. They took all their extra houses and gave them to the poor. They put out a land reform program. They put out a public free school program. They started a national health medical program, something that we Americans still don't have. The Libyans have it. He planted 40 million trees and started massive irrigation and ecological reclamation. These are some of the things that Gaddafi did, and that's a dangerous example to the Arab world. He took a bigger chunk of the oil revenues and reinvested them into the needs of his own people, And the per capita earnings of the Libyan people are the highest in the Arab world, the highest in the third world. You didn't hear that in the media, did you? You didn't hear that on Dan Rather's Tonight. That's what's dangerous about Gaddafi.